Hello, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. In this video, I'll be talking about propositions 169 through 171 in Proclus's Elements of Theology. For those of you new to the channel, of course, you're welcome to watch just these propositions, but I do invite you to watch the entire series, and I will link that playlist here. And as I have been doing throughout the series, I am using the E.R. Dodds translation. For those of you who do not have the text, there is a link in the description box for a PDF version of the text. Okay, so starting off with proposition 169. This one reads, "Every intelligence has its existence, its potency, and its activity in eternity." Now, one thing that may have jumped out at you right away is that this proposition is describing intellects in one of the traditional configurations of a triad. Everything which truly is has some essence, which is what it truly is. That's the highest flowering of its being. It also has some power or potency, and it exercises some sort of intellectual activity. So Proclus is telling us in proposition 169 that intellects, in all three of these ways that we can talk about them, they are eternal. All right, so coming back now to proposition 169, I'll take a look now at this explanation. And it starts off by saying that if it knows itself, and intelligence and its object are identical. And I'm going to pause here. It was established in the propositions that I covered in my previous video that intellects are unified. In the intelligible, subject and object are perfectly unified. Being and intellect are what we call consubsistent. Subsequent intellects are also unified, but they also revert to their priors, and thus they know their cause. The intelligible intellect, being the most exalted intellect, it does not revert to any prior, but it contains its cause within itself. And this was the focus of proposition 167, which is the one that Dodds is citing here. And I covered that in my previous video, so I'll just scroll up to refresh your memory since it was a past video. Here it is. Okay, so this one reads, "Every intelligence has intuitive knowledge of itself, but the primal intelligence knows itself only, and intelligence and its object are here numerically one. Whereas each subsequent intelligence knows simultaneously itself and its priors, so that its object is in part itself, but in part its source." Okay, let me come back here now to proposition 169. And again, he writes, "For if it knows itself, and intelligence and its object are identical, then also the intellective act is identical with the intellectual subject and the intelligible object." Now this is a bit confusing since activity in the triangle diagram that I showed you it's in the third position, analogous to intellect. And indeed, Proclus states here that this activity is an intellective act. What Proclus is saying here is that not only is the subject that reverts identical with its object, but also the intellectual activity of reversion itself is identical with both. Okay, here's the Greek for each of these three moments of the triad. The Greek word energia implies an activity in which a thing is most fully itself. So it is the result, if you will, of the three moments of the triad perfectly unified in the activity of intellect reverting to itself as a cause. Reversion fills intellect with the content of its being or existence, as Dodds translates it. It is now most fully itself, knowing itself and knowing that it knows, as Proclus showed in Proposition 168. And here's a quick reminder of this very important proposition. This one reads, "Every intelligence in the act of intellection knows that it knows. The cognitive intelligence is not distinct from that which is conscious or aware of the cognitive act." So you might think of the whole that results from reversion as the fullest flowering of that intellect. Okay, well, back at Proposition 169, Proclus goes on. "For being intermediate between the knower and the known, if these are identical, the intellective act will naturally be identical with both. What connects knower and known must be the activity of knowing. Yet if the extremities are the same, then the activity connecting them must be the same also." Now, Proclus goes on, "It is plain that the existence of intelligence is eternal, since it is a simultaneous whole." Here notice that Proclus is focused only on the existence of an intelligence, not its activity. And this sentence is a reference to Proposition 52. And this one is nice and direct. It reads, "All that is eternal is a simultaneous whole." And I'm just going to scroll down a little here to the corollary. This is the point he wants to make here, that from this it is apparent that eternity is the cause of things existing as wholes, inasmuch as all that is eternal in its existence or in its activity has the whole of its existence or activity simultaneously present to it. And so we can conclude from this that intelligence has the whole of its existence simultaneously present to it. And then Proclus goes on, "So also is the intellective act, inasmuch as it is identical with the existence. For if intelligence is unmoved, it cannot be measured by time in respect either of its being or of its activity." And here Dodds cites Proposition 50, so I'm going to jump there. And this one you can see focused on things that are in the process of coming to be. It reads, "All that is measured by time, either in its existence or in its activity, is in process of coming to be, in that respect in which it is measured by time." And being in the process of coming to be means something which becomes and never is. And so often we will contrast being, which is eternal, with becoming, which is in this process of time. Intellect, however, is unmoved. Therefore, its activity, as well as its being, is eternal. And Proclus ends by saying that if the existence and the activity of intelligence are invariable, so likewise is its potency. And this brings us back to the original triangle diagram that I opened with. Notice that potency is in the middle between existence and activity. In order to act, there must be some potency or power allowing for that being to function. And here that potency must be eternal because the existence is, so it always is. And its activity is also eternal, so it always acts. Okay, the next proposition to look at is Proposition 170. And this one reads, "Every intelligence has simultaneous intellection of all things. But while the unparticipated intelligence knows all unconditionally, each subsequent intelligence knows all in one especial aspect." Now, I think it's easy enough to see that the unparticipated intellect would know all unconditionally. What is less obvious is what is meant by this phrase describing subsequent intellects. What does it mean that they know all in one especial aspect? And the explanation begins, "For if every intelligence has its existence established in eternity, and with its existence its activity as well," and that's what we just saw in Proposition 169, "then each one will know all things simultaneously." So Proclus here is building on the previous proposition. Now, knowing all things simultaneously follows from this because all that is eternal is a simultaneous whole. That's what we saw in Proposition 52. The eternal is outside of time, so it is not divided into past, present, and future. Rather, it is one simultaneous now. And this is clarified in the next sentence. "For if it knew them by parts and in a distinguishable succession, it would not be an eternity. All that is successive is in time, since it involves an earlier and a later, and it is not a simultaneous whole." And there again is a reference to Proposition 52, that all that is eternal is a simultaneous whole. And then Proclus goes on, "If, however, all intelligences are to be alike in their manner of knowing all things, there would be no distinction between them." Well, now Proclus is looking at the series of intellects. The monad cannot be completely identical with its participants. There must be declension in the series, a downward movement, a downward in power and also into greater differentiation. And the rest of the paragraph explains this in more detail, and it's all really just one long sentence. It reads, "For what they know is themselves, and if they be alike in their universal knowledge, they would also be alike in their universal being, and there could thus be no distinction between unparticipated and participated intelligence. Identity of intellection comports identity of existence, inasmuch as the intellection of each is the same as its being, and each intelligence is identical both with its intellection and with its being." So if their knowledge were identical, then there would be no difference between them. For each intellect, its knowledge is identical with its being. Notice that Proclus doesn't even bother to argue the impossibility of unparticipated intelligence being identical with participated intelligence. At this point, it's just too obvious that there must be declension in every series. In the next paragraph, Proclus tells us what must follow from this. "It remains, then, if they are not alike in their knowledge, that each knows not all things, but one thing, or more than one, yet not all, or else all things, but in one especial aspect." Now, as Proclus likes to do, he has given us 3 logical possibilities, and now he must eliminate 2 of them. But to deny that they have intellection of all things is to assume an intelligence which is ignorant of a part of existence. And with that, he wiped out 2 of the possibilities in one sentence. And he goes on to explain, "For being unmoved, it cannot pass from point to point and gain knowledge of what before it did not know." So remember, intellect is unmoved because it is eternal. Movement requires time. Passing from point to point then also implies time. Going on to complete this idea and show the absurdity, if this were the case, he says of intellect, "Knowing one thing alone by reason of its steadfastness, it would be inferior to soul, which in its movement gets knowledge of all things." Soul, we haven't really talked about much. It's the last section of this book, but soul is the self-moved. It gets its power from intellect, but intellect itself does not move. And this is why intellect is often referred to as the unmoved mover. And now here's the last paragraph. Since then, it must know all things, or one, or else all in one especial aspect, we shall conclude that the last is the truth. So the other two possibilities have already been eliminated. Now here's Proclus's conclusion. Intellection embraces all things perpetually, and in all intelligences, but in each it delimits all its objects by a particular character. So each intellect knows all things, but from its own unique perspective. There is always some aspect, some character that predominates. And here, to round it all out, is a concise statement of the conclusion. So that in the act of cognition and in the content known, there must be some one dominant aspect under which all things are simultaneously known and by which all are characterized for the knower. This allows for there to be many intellects in the series that are subsequent to unparticipated intellect. Each intellect knows all as a simultaneous whole, but from some dominant aspect. This proposition reminds me of a similar line of reasoning that was used in conjunction with the gods. Proposition 124 looks at the gods and the particular way in which the gods know what they know. This one reads, every god has an undivided knowledge of things divided and a timeless knowledge of things temporal. He knows the contingent without contingency and the mutable immutably, and in general all things in a higher mode than belongs to their station. And in the course of the explanation here, we saw a contrast with things that are inferior. Proclus wrote, those inferiors, on the other hand, have an indeterminate thought of the determinate divine nature, and changing concepts of the immutable. Its impassibility they conceive in terms of passion, its timelessness in terms of time. And so we see here that each functions in a way that is proper to its own station in the metaphysical hierarchy. In regards to intellects, then, each knows intellectually and as a simultaneous whole, but from its own proper station in the series of intellects. Okay, Proposition 171. This one reads, every intelligence is an indivisible existence. This one here, I think, is intuitive enough. In fact, Proclus gives his reasoning for it in the very first sentence. For if it be without magnitude, body, or movement, it is indivisible. And from here, the rest is his explanation of this. For whatever is in any sense divisible is so either as a manifold or as a magnitude, or else in respect of the temporal course of its activities. But intelligence is in all respects eternal. It transcends bodies, and its manifold content is unified. Therefore, intelligence is indivisible. So we can divide things up in three ways: by number, by size, or in time. Now, intellect is eternal. Therefore, it cannot be divided by time. And by stating that intellect transcends bodies, that shows that it cannot be divided by magnitude. Intellect is triadic, so it is manifold, but that manifold is unified, so it is not divisible by number either. So that's the first paragraph. Now, to further make the case that intellect transcends bodies and so is incorporeal, Proclus draws on a principle he introduced back in Proposition 15. He writes, that intelligence is incorporeal is shown by its reversion upon itself, which we saw in Proposition 167, for bodies are incapable of such reversion. And that's Proposition 15. Let's take a look at it. Proposition 15 reads, all that is capable of reverting upon itself is incorporeal. And to further explain this, Proclus writes, the whole of a divisible substance cannot be conjoined with the whole of itself because of the separation of the parts which occupy different positions in space. Therefore, only things that are incorporeal can revert. And I think we have sufficiently established by now that intellect does indeed revert on itself. So we can go on from here. Proclus now goes on to demonstrate that intellect is not in time. That it is eternal is shown by the identity of its activity with its existence, as has been shown above, and that's Proposition 169 from the start of this video. And the last thing to demonstrate then is that as a manifold it is indeed unified. He writes, that its multiplicity is unified is shown by the continuity of the intellectual manifold with the divine henads. And I'm going to pause here to remind you of Proposition 160. Proposition 160 reads, all divine intelligence is perfect and has the character of unity. It is the primal intelligence and produces the others from its own being. And so there is a very concise statement of intellect having the character of unity. And notice the part in yellow here, that it participates the divine henads. And this is significant for the argument that Proclus is making in Proposition 171. Okay, so wrapping up Proposition 171, Proclus writes, that its multiplicity is unified is shown by the continuity of the intellectual manifold with the divine henads. For these henads are the first manifold upon which the intelligences are consequent, and therefore every intelligence, though a manifold, is a unified manifold, since the implicit exists prior to the discrete and is near to the one. And so intellect is unified by its proximity to the henads. And Proposition 62 is the one that shows that unity is commensurate with power. The unified ranks higher than the discrete. I also want to remind you of Proposition 6, even though Dodds did not cite this one. I haven't gone back to this one in quite a while, but once you look at it, you'll see very quickly why it's relevant. This one reads, every manifold is composed either of unified groups or of henads. Here is where the term henads was first introduced, and it's also where Proclus first introduced us to the idea that the henads are the first manifold, or what he calls here a unified group. See in yellow, a unified group, if it has a unity by participation, it's a henad if it is a constituent of the first unified group. And when we carry with us this idea to Proposition 171, we can perhaps better appreciate the argument that Proclus is putting forth here. So if you found this video helpful, I would appreciate you giving it a like, and also please subscribe if you don't already. That really helps the channel grow. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to leave them below. Thank you very much.